Welcome to The Economy Magazine. I'm Benjamin Chong Alfares with the main stories in the global economy. Today's magazine, Beijing takes greater steps to tackle air pollution nationwide. And Morocco struggles with domestic worker abuse. First, look at the headlines. Japan's economy grew less than expected in the final quarter of 2013, weighed down by weak household spending and exports. The country's gross domestic product expanded at an annualized pace of 1% in the final 3 months of the year. Economists had predicted a 2.8% rise. The figures raised doubts about Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's ability to revive consumer confidence enough to sustain a recovery. As the nation's sales tax will be raised to 8% from 5% in April, the lull in growth further fuels concerns. India's government will cut taxes to help boost consumption and reanimate the fragile economy, but says it remains committed to narrowing the budget deficit. The cut in indirect taxes on cars and mobile phones comes ahead of upcoming elections. The finance minister said the fiscal deficit for the 12 months ending March 31st would be 4.6% of GDP. By March 2015, the deficit is projected to narrow further to 4.1%. But economists question the government's approach as the fiscal deficit remains large despite efforts to contain it, and government borrowing chokes private investment. We stay in India, where Arvind Kejriwal resigned as chief minister of the Delhi state less than 2 months after voters gave his Common Man Party an unexpected mandate. Following his resignation, Kejriwal's party has a better chance of utilizing its limited resources to fight a national campaign. The Common Man Party leader could split the vote in the upcoming general election. Kejriwal covets a share of India's urban constituencies, where his populist policies are likely to resonate. But some say Kejriwal's ascent is bad news for business, at least under the current arrangements.
I'm a very insignificant person. I have no status. I am one of you. I didn't come here for power or for the chair. And that is why our government hereby resigns. We have quit today for the sake of the Jan Lokpal bill.
As Israel's economy hit a 4-year low in the second half of 2013, economists wonder whether the data points to a continuing slump. The economy grew by a mere 2.8% in the second half of 2013, its worst showing since 2009. Gross domestic product in the second half was dragged down by a 1.1% annualized decline in exports of goods and services. The GDP data follows a report that January's consumer price index fell 0.6%, double the decline economists had forecast. And we stay in Israel, where internet giant Google acquired Slick Login. The Israeli startup is behind the technology that allows websites to verify a user's identity through sound waves. It plays a nearly silent sound through computer speakers, which is then analyzed by a smartphone app to confirm the user's identity. The technology can be used either as a replacement for a password or as an additional security layer. And Libya continues to be mired in a deep economic crisis since the mid-2013 closure of its main oil sites. Supporters of the federal system in East Libya have blocked the main oil terminal since July. The blockade has forced oil production down to 250,000 barrels per day from 1.5 million before. Production rose to 570,000 barrels after a blockade in the south was lifted, but dropped again following renewed protests. The oil sector contributes 70% of GDP, 95% of government revenues, and 98% of exports. Libya has suffered losses estimated at more than $10 billion since July. China's government will set up a $1.65 billion fund to reduce air pollution in its largest cities. The cabinet also announced subsidies, tax changes, energy efficiency standards, and pollution controls aimed at improving environmental quality. The following report by Daniel Roth takes a closer look.
China's capital, Beijing, is covered in hazardous levels of smog. The current bout has gone on for days. The PM 2.5 index, which measures fine particle matter in the air caused by pollutants, reached a level of over 500 this weekend. Levels above 300 are considered hazardous, though the World Health Organization recommends that levels not exceed 25. According to a study by Greenpeace and Peking University, exposure to PM 2.5 particles in the air contributed to 8,572 premature deaths in 4 major cities in China and to an economic hit of $1.08 billion in 2012. As well, Beijing saw a 10% drop in tourism in the first 11 months of 2013.
It's very hard to breathe. It's really big smoke here, and when I see it first time, it's fascinating how they can live here with this air. And it's really hard to breathe. I'm a smoker, but it's enough strong for me.
Curbing pollution is taking more of a center stage in China as government leaders are looking for economic and ecological stability to balance out the last decades of extreme growth that has wreaked havoc on the country's environment. Recently, authorities introduced a new smog alert system that will force controls on driving and factory production if 3 days in a row of hazardous air are forecast. The government has said it will put $494.5 billion towards facing the overall challenge, with $1.65 billion focused on air pollutants. Much of the money will go to support companies that work toward greater energy efficiency and lowering emissions. China and the U.S., the world's #1 and #2 greenhouse gas emitters respectively, recently made plans to limit those numbers.
I'm very pleased to report today that we have completed implementation plans for those 5 initiatives on heavy-duty vehicles, on smart grid for the delivery of energy, on carbon capture, utilization, and storage, on energy efficiency, and finally on collection and management of data.
Beijing has announced that it will shut down 300 factories this year and that they will be moving from coal to gas in order to generate power and heating in the winter. It is unclear whether China can find a sustainable equilibrium with their environment as their economy continues to grow.
We're joined now by Asia business expert Tal Reshev for a look at the Chinese government's approach to the air pollution crisis in China. Mr. Reshev, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
So we understand that China basically is home to 16 of the world's 20 most polluted cities in the world. All we ever really see about China is how much they're concerned about 7.5% growth, and it's always about the economy. Does the government really care about pollution, and to what extent?
Well, the government does care, and it cares on 2 levels. First of all, because as a communist regime, their commitment is to the people. We tend to forget it, but they do not forget it. And after they have achieved the great progress in terms of economy, they want also to let the people live well with this level. And it means, among other things, reducing the pollution. Second point is more crucial. The satisfaction, the happiness, the well-being of the people affects very much their attitude regarding the regime. And the Chinese regime is afraid in a very deep way from issues from that direction that may affect the stability. So if something like this adds to the feeling of discontentment of the people, it is something that concerns very much the regime.
Right. Well, I mean, we've seen that there have been estimates of thousands of people dying of the pollution. Some estimates say over 1 million people die of this of the pollution every year. What are the solutions here? What can they possibly do? They're throwing money at the problem, but what are the actual solutions to this issue?
Well, they've tried almost in any possible direction, like closing down factories, like passing from certain sources of energy to other sources which are cleaner. They also try the Chinese way to put the responsibility on the local authorities to give them a target of level of pollution, solve it the way you want. And some of them in some regions of China, what they've done is that they have limited the hours that factories can work.
I guess this is one of the advantages of the fact that it's a regime that imposes its power, so to speak.
Absolutely, but there are limits to it because pollution is not the only thing that the regime is caring about. They also want to continue with the growth of the GDP because they want to have more jobs, they want to have more prosperity for the people. And if you are reducing the hours of work of the factories, you're reducing the production, the GDP, and the places of work. I mean, there's a kind of balance between the two that they have to keep, which is not easy at all.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for those comments, Mr. Tal Reshef, Asia business expert. To move on to another story in Morocco. Morocco's government is gradually increasing regulation of domestic workers, but human rights activists say it is not enough to avoid the rampant abuse of domestic labor, many of whom are child workers. More in the next report.
Here in the Rabat neighborhood of Mokif, housemaids often wait for work. Fatiha has been cleaning houses since the age of 11, and from the beginning, she's suffered abuse.
When my employer went out, she would leave me next to a dog that was trained to bite me if I moved. Some people told my brother about it, and he came to my rescue. She tortured me with burns, and I still have the scars.
Morocco has no laws protecting domestic workers, but Parliament has tabled a bill aimed at regulating the profession. It would give workers contracts with a minimum wage, 1 day's holiday per week, and an annual leave allowance. Employers who flaunt these terms would be fined. Human rights groups say it doesn't do enough to protect workers from abuse or ban minors from working.
It's too bad that in 2014 we're still talking about this dangerous phenomenon of child labor. And what's worse is the violence which can lead to death.
Activists have stepped up pressure on the government after a public outcry over the death of a child housemaid. 14-year-old Fatima died after suffering severe burns. Her employer was found guilty of her death and handed a 20-year jail term. Officials counter that real progress has been made to reduce the numbers of child workers.
It should be noted that Morocco has made great progress these past years on this issue. The number of child workers who are under 15 has dropped from 600,000 to 100,000.
Activists are now looking to the government to become the first country in the Middle East and North Africa to ratify the Domestic Workers Treaty.
And we go now to Media Watch with Daniel Roth. So Daniel, thanks for joining us, first of all.
How's it going?
Good. I understand that we have a story about Robert Reich.
Yeah, so former Secretary of Labor,
Right.
Yale educated, Oxford educated, worked under Bill Clinton, under President Carter, came out with a movie late last year called Inequality for All, won a special U.S. documentary award.
Right.
Really detailing the state of the U.S. economy and the reality that inequality is growing. Post 2007, 2008, he was talking about a depression. He was saying, you know, when you look at the numbers, these are depression numbers.
Right. He's specifically comparing the numbers also to the times of the Depression.
Yeah, he's saying, like, you know, when you look at 2007 versus, 1928,
Right.
You're looking at,
Which we can actually see, we could just see it behind you.
Yeah. So
okay.
we're looking at scenes from the film Inequality for All.
Okay.
So he, you know, and he's really calling into question the entire basis of the system as it's evolved from the late 70s on, and he's talking about the fact that in the post-World War II era, you really see growth when the middle class is growing.
Right.
The economy doubled in size.
The thing I think also that really caught my attention is that it was the biggest middle class essentially that developed between the post-World War II era until the late 70s, isn't it?
Yeah. And that, he says, is, he has this line, the reason we're actually talking about this is he wrote a piece recently in Alternet. And in there, he has this line, this great line. He says, although a rising tide would lift all boats, many of America's richest prefer a lower tide and bigger yachts.
Bigger yachts, right.
And it's, it really resonates. And that's, he's talking about these 3 points, reasons why America maybe hasn't learned anything from the success it had from 1946 up until the late 70s, early 80s. And he's saying, number one, that people talk about job creators being corporations, the CEOs are the job creators. He's saying actually consumers are the job creators, the people who buy stuff.
Sure.
And so he's saying also that you need strong unions to protect people's wages so that they can buy stuff. And, he's talking about the growing gap between the middle class and the rich.
Okay. Well, on that growing gap note, we're going to have to go. Thank you very much for telling us more about Robert Reich. You should all see that movie. It's all the time we have for you today. Please send us your comments via the feedback on our website and Twitter. And do join us again tomorrow.